All right. If we're good to go, then I'm Jessica Fackler.
I'm Jameson Modenberg.
I'm Jacob Focus.
And I'm Josh Davis. Today we're going to be talking about the two-high safety look and how to defeat it. So the two-high safety look is a defensive alignment where both safeties are going to line up deep and protect their half of the field. Teams will do this to directly limit the chances of an explosive play and minimize the danger of a deep threat. So why are we talking about it? Well, everybody's doing it. It's just become a league-wide trend. The NFL is a league of trends, and right now this just happens to be where we're at. So you'll remember a few years ago, Mel Kiper went viral for saying that the two-high look should be outlawed. While he is right that quarterbacks aren't putting up crazy numbers anymore as often, and the deep ball isn't happening as often, it's still been very effective, so defenses are going to keep using it. Offensive points per game decreased from 24.8 to 21.8 across the 2020 to 2023 season, and this past season had the lowest quarterback passing attempts per game since 2004. One example of this is Patrick Mahomes. When he came to the league in the second season, 2018, and won MVP, his ADOT was over 9. He was throwing the ball all over the field, deep shots, crazy highlight plays, and over time, teams just decided to put a cap on what he could do. His ADOT dropped all the way to near 6, and people on Twitter would say he was boring, which is crazy. But basically, defenses had to make Patrick Mahomes boring to stop him. So why employ a two-high look? Well, the two-high look is a shell coverage that will limit explosive plays. And explosive plays are important in today's NFL because they drive scoring. On average, drives with 0 explosive plays in the NFL this season scored on a touchdown on only 6.3% of drives, as well as teams with a +2 in the explosive play category against their opponent in a game won about 80% of the time. So explosives win games. And we'll also see that from this graph on the right here. We have a two-high safety rate on the x-axis with an explosive play rate against them on the y-axis. And our teams in blue are going to be teams that made the playoffs this season. So if we look at quadrant 4, we're going to see a lot of teams, most of these teams made the playoffs this season. So this is preventing explosive plays is really important in today's NFL. Another thing about 2025 is we had some special teams rule changes. First of all, the kickoff and touchback rules have changed, so teams are starting closer to scoring position than ever before. Also, the modified K-balls allow teams and kickers to work in and practice with the balls they're going to use in the games ahead of time, which has lengthened the range of kickers and made longer field goals easier. As we saw, Cam Little hit some crazy long field goals this year, and there were lots of longer field goals attempted than we've ever seen before. So teams are essentially one explosive play away from scoring points. So controlling explosives is very important.
So now just to get into a little bit of the data, looking at when two-high safeties are employed, this looks specifically against what type of offense you're facing. We see that when an offense has a better passing EPA on their plays, we see a two-high safety employed more often. That's typically in order to prevent that pass from happening. But when we have offenses that are worse at rushing the ball or running the ball, we see that two-high safeties are still employed at a higher level in order to prevent that pass, because that's typically where they're going to go. These two kind of fall hand in hand with each other. And when we look at the 2025 season and who employed it the most, we see the Seahawks up there at the top with almost 79%. On the right-hand column, we see their overall EPA per play on all plays, their overall defensive ranking there. The Seahawks have Kobe Bryant and Julian Love, but they also have guys like Nick Emmanwori in the middle of the field who are very athletic and big, that allow the Seahawks to be more versatile and play more in other formations that other teams might not have the opportunity to do. And looking at teams with the least usage, we see the Browns at the top there with only using two high about 30% of the time. They have Grant Delpit and Ronnie Hickman, two very above average safeties this year, and they had Myles Garrett as well. They were a very good overall defense, and yet they used the two high safety fields.
When we take a look at effectiveness in the two high, it's no surprise that we see the Houston Texans at the top of this list. Obviously, they had a stellar season defensively this year, led by a great front, but also led by Jalen Petrie as well, one of the greatest safeties in the NFL today. Additionally, when you pair that with a guy like Kalen Bullock, who's also an above-average safety in the NFL, it's no doubt why they found success. Additionally, if you take a look a little bit lower on this leaderboard towards the Jaguars and the Broncos, they had very low explosive play rates as well, which is the reason why we see them here on the screen. When we take a look at some of the not so great defenses in the two high, it's unfortunately not much of a surprise here either. A lot of these teams, quite frankly, weren't very good. If we take a look at the case study of the Bengals, they allowed a lot of explosive plays and a lot of EPA per play in the two high look. But this isn't necessarily due to their safeties, believe it or not. Jordan Battle and Geno Stone, both above average safeties, but the rest of their defense was really struggling, and it's part of the reason they have one of the worst defensive performances historically in the NFL this year. Overall, as a league summary, we already talked about the Seahawks a little bit. They're very effective in the two high, and they use it often. It's part of the reason they won the Super Bowl this year. We also talked about the Browns a little bit as well. We feel as though they should use the two high more as they are effective. You see that success number. The fact that it's negative means the defense is doing a good job, obviously, in terms of EPA. But they're only using it a little under 30% of the time. We think they could bump that up a little bit. When we take a look at a team that perhaps should be using the two high look a little bit less, we see the San Francisco 49ers. Obviously, their season this year was impacted by some injuries, and they didn't necessarily account for those injuries and the lack of skill that they had on their team and continued to run the two high look and continue to get beat throughout the season. And then another team that wasn't necessarily very effective, not only in the two high look, but overall on defense this year was not in the New York Jets. But we will say we give them a point of pride that they were conscious of the fact that they were not very good in the two high, and for that reason did not win much accordingly.
So now looking a little bit more to what game scenarios and game states cause an increase in this two high, not so much just the offensive ability. We ran an extra boost to predict the probability of a two high coverage being employed, given game state factors such as the time remaining in the half, the score differential, the down distance, and overall distance to the end zone. And then we also controlled for offensive and defensive abilities, which consisted of those offensive and defense passing EPA per play and rushing EPA per play, as well as the offense's passing rate over expected. And the same for the defense, but for the defense, it was the average of all the passing rate over expected that they saw for the 2025 season. Looking into these SHAP values of our results, we see that up on the top of this plot are the more important factors that push and influence on the probability of a two high safety occurring. We see that the yards to go, as there's a lower amount of yards to go, teams are less likely to go into the two high safety because the offenses are less likely to pass the ball. They will typically run and get those shorter distances that way. Also see that as the offense has a lower margin of lead, or typically when they're down in games more or less, defenses are more likely to go into that two high as the offense is looking to pass the ball more in order to make up for that deficit that they may be in. And then we could look specifically at the defensive capabilities here as well. When a defense is very good at protecting the rush, so they have a lower or negative EPA in our case here. There's a higher probability that they go into a two high. If they're better at protecting the rush, they're going to stay a little bit further on the back and kind of help themselves protect the pass a little bit more. And we see that when they're not as good at protecting the pass, that they're going to stay back and protect the pass in the two high safety. Again, those two kind of go hand in hand as they would in the offensive way that we mentioned before. And to look a little bit more closely at the down and distance interaction effect, because that we feel is the most important factor when it comes to game situation running at two high safety. We ran again just with the same model effects just to get a better interaction here. And we see at the top right of this plot is going to be the later downs at the greater distance to go on that down. And we see that there's a higher probability in that corner and a kind of darker, lighter in that top corner, showing that later downs, greater distance to go, there's going to be a greater probability of a two high safety being employed.
So now we have a better understanding of why and when defenses choose to employ a two high look. But the question remains, how the hell do we beat it? And it's a bit of a loaded question for something that we like to call the quote-unquote fog of war associated with this look. It can be difficult for offenses to identify for a couple different reasons. The first of this being that it's easily disguised by defenses, or at least can be easily disguised by defenses. Additionally, we find that defenses can audible into or out of a two high look very effectively and they have a propensity to do so, which is very high. And lastly, we also see that they can rotate in and out and give the offense many different looks. So this fog of war kind of let us in how we chose to approach answering this question.
So our chosen decision process, are going to employ a partially observable Markov decision process. This is used to determine the action that optimizes reward. So the general thought process behind this is when the offense is making a decision, there are aspects of the game that are observable to them, and there are aspects of the game that are hidden. This sort of ties into the whole game theory information set sort of thinking. But for the offense, the observables are what play they're actually calling, which we sort of reduce to personnel, receiver spread, and receiver route depth mix. Game state is observable, time, score, down and distance, and then team quality, both the offensive team and the defensive team that they're facing is observable. For the hidden state, we have the defensive play call. Like Jacob was talking about, that sort of fog of war where the offense struggles to recognize what the defense is throwing at them. We're assuming that the offense doesn't actually know whether the defense is in too high or not when they're making their play call, and can only form their best guess at whether or not the defense might be. And then the action for the offense is the actual play that they decide on, and our reward will be measured in predicted EPA. So here's sort of a general layout of what we're going to do. We're going to start with a model for predicting or for forming a belief to predict if the defense isn't too high. So we know the offense has to make an assumption about the defense based only on the things that they know about the defense, or about the game in general. So that goes back to game state, also defensive tendencies to be too high, and then the offensive setup. Since the defense is sort of reacting to what sort of personnel the offense is throwing out, the offense can consider that into forming their belief of the probability of the too high. So we combine these factors into a logit to form the belief for the offense. Next, we're going to predict EPA by determining the success of any possible play call. The purpose behind this is that the offense must know their potential reward for every action that they might choose to employ. So we included game state, team qualities again, whether or not the defense is in too high, and then the offensive play call to overall include in the linear model to predict EPA. After this, we need to compute the expected reward and determine which plays are optimal in any given situation. So we're going to do this by combining the two models I just talked about, our belief model and our predicted EPA model, to form an overall predicted EPA using an expected value formula. So this formula takes the belief, which is the probability that the defense is in too high, and multiplies it by the predicted EPA given that the defense is in too high. And then it also adds the converse situation of that, which is 1 minus the belief and multiplied by the offense's expected EPA given that the defense isn't in too high. So then we can account for how a play would look in both possible circumstances that the defense throws out of the offense. And then for each possible play, we have the predicted EPA. And it stands to reason that plays with overall the highest predicted EPA would be the optimal actions in any situation. However, we want to generally avoid predictability as the offense, so we're going to employ a mixed strategy.
In accordance with the theory stuff by John Nash, the father of game theory, we understand that the optimal choice is not necessarily the optimal choice over time. For that reason, we have to create a mixed strategy, a portfolio or repertoire, a menu of plays, if you will, with relative weights that tell us when and why to use them. This essentially gives us an inherent play calling diversity associated with our process.
So with implementing our mixed strategy, we then want to actually implement our plays and run the recommended plays based on our portfolio. So here we have an example of an ideal mixed strategy in the specific situation where the offense has 1st and 10 in their own territory, where they are predicting an 80% probability that the defense isn't too high. This is a little bit on the higher end of a predicted too high probability, but is just sort of shown to demonstrate a potential offensive catalog for how they would react to a defense playing too high. So each row here is, again, not a specific play, but it's combinations of personnel, alignment, play types, and route depth profiles to generate our predicted EPA for that play. And then each combination has a mixed strategy weight associated with it. What this number essentially means is for the first row, so O1 personnel, spread, pass, and mixed route profile, over a large sample of game situations that follow this situation, 1st and 10 own territory, 80% probability of too high. Over this large sample, you should employ this first row combination about 26.1% of the time, second row about 18.8% of the time, etc., all the way down. So what this benefits us by doing is it implements a like Jacob was saying, a menu of plays that we're able to run. It mixes up depth of passing plays. It has 2 rushing plays in here as well as 4 passing plays so that we don't get too predictable. And you can see here it generally favors some of those short or intermediate passing plays. We believe this makes a lot of sense, favoring short and intermediate passing plays, because it's sort of a wear the defense down strategy against the 2 high. Here you can see on the graph cumulative successful short passing plays so far in the game compared with explosive play rate. We see that as the offense has accumulated more successful short passes, they see a greater percentage of explosive plays. So overall, you're able to wear down the defense with successful short or intermediate passes, get the 2 high safeties to bite a little bit more, and then you're able to see some more explosive plays, especially later in the game when they become more crucial.
Okay, so now for the matchup example, we're going to look at the Kansas City Chiefs against the Minnesota Vikings. We chose the Chiefs because in our data, they had the most looks against the 2 high defense, but of the teams we were able to choose from, the Bills, the Patriots, the Chiefs, they actually had the lowest EPA against these 2 high looks. So we're going to look at how the Chiefs would adjust their game plan against a heavy 2 high team like the Minnesota Vikings. The table on the right, the percentages are the increase or decrease in recommendation against a 2 high compared to not a 2 high. Look, we'll see that the short and intermediate mix is a plus 36% and our deep shot is negative. This makes sense because against the 2 high, the defense, they're going to put a shell over us and they're not going to let us attack down the field. We also see the benefit of being 11 personnel. We saw that a little bit in our mixed strategies, but we want the tight end on the field and we see that we have an advantage there. Finally, the spread alignment seems to be the best way to do it. We want to spread out the defense so we can attack the holes in the coverage effectively with our quarterback. So now we'll get into the play that we created. We used a basic dagger concept with some crossing routes and drag routes attached to it. We call it gun trips left, Y cross. So essentially we have 3 receivers on the left side, including the tight end. We have 1 receiver out wide to the right, and then we have a running back in that we can do whatever we want with him. We can kind of have him pass protect, or we can have it be a check down option. Starting left to right with our X receiver, we have Rashee Rice, who we feel like is our best receiver over the middle, explosive with the ball in his hands for some yak opportunity. So we want him running that 10 to 15 yard in cut, which is our ideal read here on this play. The inside receiver, number 1, Xavier Worthy, he's going to be our field stretcher in this scenario. We want him pushing the defense. If they're going to be in a shell, we want to push the top of that shell as far up as we can. And this is a guy with game-breaking speed, so he's the perfect guy for this role. Then the tight end, we have Travis Kelce, and he's going to run a crossing route to kind of spread the linebackers out. We want him to cross the face of the linebackers in order to create space for Rashee Rice working over top and in between these holes. And then on the other side, we have Hollywood Brown kind of running a drag route as just the last option on this play. So since we're facing this Vikings defense, if they come out in this look, we feel confident in our protection against their 4-man rush. The Vikings don't have the best pass rush in the league, and our offensive line in the middle, we have an all-pro center, one of the best right guards in the league, a left guard that has shown a lot this year. So against their interior pass rush, we feel really good. And then we also can help on either of the defensive ends if we need to. You know, Jonathan Bernard's a really good pass rusher. If we need to double him or give some extra attention there, we have that flexibility to do so. So against a base cover 2 or cover 4 or cover 2-man look, we feel like this dagger concept will work really well for us. We have Patrick Mahomes. He'll be able to make any throw on the field. But ideally, we're looking at that in route from Rashee Rice to be open behind the linebackers. But the Vikings could throw anything at us. We talked about the fog of war earlier, and especially with the Vikings and Brian Flores, we know that they like to send pressure and they like to be confusing. So if they send pressure, we have a few man-beating routes on the field. I mean, we have Hollywood Brown. He can be open underneath for us as a check down. Remember, it's 1st and 10, so we're just not trying to have a negative play here. And we also have Travis Kelce running across the field. Some other things they could possibly do is they could rotate into a cover 3. If one of these safeties comes down into the middle of the field, that's worrying for our Rashee Rice is our inbreaker. We don't want that robber to kind of jump our route. But if they do rotate into a cover 3, we have Travis Kelce running across the field. We like that matchup with the Vikings weak side linebacker and Eric Wilson. You know, he's on the wrong side at 30 years old. He's not as great in coverage, and we feel like that's something we can exploit. So in conclusion, we ran an XG boost using game state and many other situational factors to predict if too high safety is played. Then we had our Markov decision process that considers the decisions teams face, and we implement the mid strategy model and how we can maximize our EPA on a current play, given as we created a portfolio there. And then finally, the game plan for the Chiefs Vikings, we want to attack the middle of the defense with intermediate passes and to spread the linebackers out and find the holes in the zone.
That's all. Thank you for taking the time to listen. Do you have any questions?
That's from me.
Go to
The
Miami,
verdict
guys.
summers.
That.
You guys could just repeat what you guys said. We missed what you guys cut in and out when you started talking.
Sorry, my bad. I was just saying, good job, guys. Really good stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I thought it was creative and
Yeah,
really well
nope.
done presentation. I just want to make sure. I was a little surprised that when you did the teams that used too high the most, that you didn't come out with the Vikings near the top.
So they actually fell right off the list at 7. It was interesting to see. The way we considered it too high was based on in either a cover 2 man, cover 2, cover 4, or when two safeties were employed, which could partly be the reason why in that case where we encompassed it was just under 50% of the plays, I believe.
Okay.
We talked about kind of like the fog of war, how there can be some sort of disguise there in we used the play-by-play data set we had to calculate these numbers, and I think we did it the best we could have. But I do understand that it may be confusing the Vikings didn't appear on this list.
Yeah, I think the use of just sort of when two safeties were in play just sort of changes the numbers a little bit, but that's interesting that that's where that comes from. So that makes sense.